Hi, my name is Daniel Ruan, and I'm an architecture PhD student at the University of Michigan. I think most people here have backgrounds in engineering or construction, so I'd like to apologize on behalf of architects for making your jobs difficult. So today I'll be presenting our paper titled Reducing Uncertainty in Multi-Robot Construction Through Perception Modeling and Adaptive Fabrication, co-authored by Professors Arash, Adel, and Mcgee, also from the University of Michigan. So to briefly introduce our lab, this research is conducted as part of ADR Laboratory directed by Professor Adel, and I'm also a research assistant there. ADR is an interdisciplinary laboratory for advanced research in architecture, computational design, and robotic construction. Here in the images, you can see some of our previous research and projects. So this is an overview of what I'm going to be presenting today. And at the end, I'll also briefly be showing some of the new research we've completed since the submission of the paper. So to start with in the introduction, the problem statement that we are addressing covers four main challenges in robotic timber construction. Material imperfections that can arise through bending, warping, other material properties of wood. The necessity of tight fabrication tolerances to ensure proper fit and structural connections. The relatively high complexity of construction tasks, which are quasi-repetitive in nature, and the lack of developed suitable human-robot interfaces for multi-robotic construction. So to look at some of the related work in the literature, we can break the problem statement down into parts and see how it's been addressed. So multi-robotic fabrication, of course, as we've also seen earlier today, has long been in use in other industries, such as the automotive, endlessly performing well-synchronized repetitive tasks in an assembly line. Cooperative robotic fabrication for construction, however, is still being explored. When dealing with material imperfections or unstructured environments, such as on the construction site, the calibration of each robot relative to each other becomes super important. So pictured on the right here is the spatial timbers assemblies research at ETH Zurich, which adapts a multi-robot system for non-standard spatial construction and relies on a highly calibrated IGPS system to coordinate the system. So next up in light timber assembly, light timber as a material has been an interest for additive robotic processes due to its workability, sustainability, and aesthetics. Various research have started to incorporate perception as a method for dynamically working with timber. For example, Eversman and others use scanning to calculate the gripping and placement of differently sized shingles, while Deviations and others reference a haptic fiducial to calibrate a workpiece cutting process. In the current literature, however, there is a gap for a fully closed adaptive process that can combine these techniques into an integrated digital design to fabrication workflow. So to tie this together, there's recent research utilizing adaptive processes for subtractive robotic manufacturing, such as in carving in wood. Pictured here, you can see adaptive processes being utilized for the localization and calibration of a mobile robotic fabrication system for building scale mesh welding used in the DFAB house project, also at ETH Zurich. So to summarize some of the literature, robotic cooperation is still being explored for construction. Current robotic light timber techniques lack a closed loop adaptive process, and research has explored adaptive processes for subtractive manufacturing, localization, and calibration. So then the objectives for this paper is split into three parts. Firstly, to develop an adaptive process for multi-robotic construction assembly, to minimize material imperfections and manufacturing inaccuracies, and to evaluate the developed processes through physical experimentation. So I'm now going to quickly go through the fabrication setup that we utilize in this paper, and a lot of it was custom developed for this and related research. So our robotic work cell consists of two 6-axis industrial arms mounted on parallel and linear tracks. We named the robots here in the lab based on their cardinal position. So in this case, the robot on the longer track on the right is named north and the other one is south. And both robots have access to a custom 3-axis CNC saw, a tool changing stand, and assembly stand where the construction takes place. So the 3-axis saw was developed to enable compound cuts with a rotation axis for the miter angles and tilt axis for the bevel angle. The third linear axis raises and lowers the saw and can be adjusted to cut materials of varying depth. The timber grippers on each robot uses pneumatic activation and textured 3D printed pads to firmly grip an element in place. And then both robots also share a profile scanner, which outputs an ordered point cloud in word coordinates using a frame transformation. The scanning region here is trapezoidal, and the tool center point is calibrated to the center of that scanning region. So we tie everything together into a computational workflow. So the computational model is handled by Rhino, a CAD modeling software, as well as Grasshopper, which is a graphical algorithm editor for Rhino, as well as Python. The generated toolpaths are processed using Supermatter tools, which is a plugin developed by Professor Mcgee. And the robotic motion is controlled using KUKA's KRC4 controllers, whereas the saw, pneumatic grippers, and scanning is handled by TwinCat PLC. So now I'll be going into more detail about the fabrication process. So this is an overview of the fabrication process where we create a feedback loop between the computational design and the as-built structure through perception, reasoning, and acting. So to go into a bit more detail, we start with the scanning process, which is how we measure the as-built structure, and this also provides the input for our adaptive process. So there are 3 distinct steps in the scanning process. First, the point cloud is captured and filtered to remove any backgrounds. We use a simple offset bounding box based on the original predicted geometry to perform this filtering. The filter point cloud is then used to reconstruct the element geometry, most notably its end planes and center frame. And then we use the reconstructed geometry to then measure deviation from the digital model and also use it to then update the adaptive process. So the adaptive process is the crux of the paper. We introduce adaptation in the digital design to fabrication workflow to reduce deviations between the digital and the as-built models. I'll be using this diagram to help illustrate the equations and relationship between the different poses. The diagram is depicted in 2 dimensions, but it can be generalized to 6 dimensions required for quasi-static spatial assembly. So that is position, X, Y, Z, and then the orientation, roll, pitch, yaw. So a quick note about notation. We use lowercase p to denote a pose in space. The superscript on the pose indicates the reference coordinate frame of the pose. And then transformations are denoted by an uppercase T, with the subscript indicating the frames it transforms to and from in that order. So for example, here, T subscript LW denotes the transformation from the world coordinate frame to the laser scans TCP frame. So the first step in the adaptive process is to identify the relationship between the ground truth placement of an element and the perception of that element. So this observation results in a small deviation due to any scan errors, whether due to sensor noise or reconstruction inaccuracy. This relationship is dependent on that TLW, which we can derive by composing transformations from world to robot root to flange, and then flange to laser TCP. Of these transformations, both TRW from world to root and TLFR from flange to laser are user calibrated, while the TFR from root to flange is calculated by the robot controller, but can still contain a very slight inaccuracy due to loading conditions. So one of the main objectives of the adaptive process is to minimize the impact of any of these errors through the transformations. So by applying this equation to multiple robots, we can calculate a different as-built perceived pose of that placed element for each robot. We can calculate a perception transform between each robot, and this tells us how the perceptual coordinate systems between each robot are shifted. We can refine then this estimation through iterative learning control over multiple element placements. Once we have the as-built perceived pose, we can relate it to the digital model to calculate the measured deviation. And then this completes the measurement loop of the adaptive process. From here, we move on to the next element. So for the next element in an assembly sequence, we apply a correction estimate to the digital model to get a target pose for that element. This correction estimate is initialized as an identity matrix at the very beginning. That is, we assume all our calibration exact and correct. And then we are then refining this estimate through future placement loops. So when placing an element, we encounter 3 sources of error. The gripper error, or the error between the user calibrated TCP frame and the element's true center. Process error, which can come about from inaccurate cutting or slight shifting while fastening. So this is one of the major sources of error through the entire fabrication process. And then there's also the scan error, which we mentioned before. These three deviations together give us the offset of how far our perceived poses from the predicted target. And then we use this offset to then update our correction estimate, completing the adaptive loop. So altogether, there are two main ways of applying this adaptive process. In the first, we arbitrarily designate a robot as the primary robot, and all other robots adapt to its coordinate frame, basically setting a global world route. In the second method, each robot in the system adapts to each other, which increases the overall system's abilities to respond to deviations. So we apply both of these processes through experimentations in the discussed robotic work cell. And we envision that there are sort of three levels of complexity to applying this research. First, in a 2D planar stack of elements. Secondly, in a 2.5D planar wall assembly. And finally, in a fully spatial 3D non-planar wall. So this paper primarily focuses on the first case, the planar stack. And while this is somewhat trivial in design, it helps demonstrate the adaptive process in a limited number of dimensions, where the research variables consist just of the target pose, the scan pose, and a planar deviation in the X, Y directions in a single rotation. So we set up the experiments with these three processes, looking at a base case with no adaptation, along with the two outlined adaptive approaches. The specific experimental task is to cut a piece of timber into a 1 meter length and stack 10 of them high, alternating between each robot in each step. The stack is fastened and scanned between each element, and the adaptive processes applied were prescribed. So this is really a test to show how well the two robots can coordinate together in a coordinated assembly task. So jumping to the results, as a quick visual illustration, you can see here on the left-hand side that without adaptation, there's a very clear offset between the two robots. The elements are very clearly misaligned, likely due to slight inaccuracy in how their coordinate systems are defined. And on the right side, this is the third process where both robots use adaptation. You can observe a much more neatly stacked lamination of elements. So then looking at this graphically, there's some quick observations here. So in case you can't really read the legend here, everything in blue was scanned by the south robot, everything in red was scanned by the north. So you can see there's these two distinct color groups showing the offset in their perceptual coordinate spaces. In the first process, you can see there's actually two distinct clusters within each robot's perception showing the offset of elements placed between the two robots. And then curiously, in the third process, you can see there's like the slight drift happening as the stack progresses, likely because both robots are adapting to each other and there's no external bounding conditions to keep the stack in line, which I'll talk a bit about later. So here are the same results depicted numerically, with the base case observing an average deviation of about 1.28 millimeters. And with the second process with one primary robot, the average deviation was 0.45 millimeters, so sub 1 millimeter. And then finally, both robots adapting each other, we had almost 2 millimeters of deviation. So to understand that third process a bit more, here's a heat map of the sort of deviations. And you'd actually see the third process is what I describe as having probably the most smooth sort of stack in the process. And you can see that starting from the fourth element, there's some sort of deviation either through the fastening or the material that sort of started offsetting the rest of the stack. So I imagine that with external boundary conditions in place, that can actually help make that process even more accurate and in line with the adaptive process. So I want to quickly go over the conclusion and give a quick peek about some of the new work that we've been doing since the publication of this paper. So in summary, we have introduced an adaptive process for multiple robots working cooperatively on a construction task. And initial experiments results demonstrate the potential for this adaptive process to decrease fabrication deviations due to setup and calibration errors by utilizing robotic perception. So in the new work, we've started exploring and applying the adaptive process to non-trivial assemblies, starting with the planar wall. So here you can see some images of the fabrication process. On the left is the scanning of predictive contact points within the wall. On the right is an example of the completed assembly. So you can imagine when doing a cooperative robotic assembly task like this, it's very easy for elements to start colliding with each other if you don't actually utilize perception due to any slight bending or inaccuracies in placement. This is a short clip, which I hope will play. So this is just a clip of the element processing and placement. Just prior to this, there was the scanning and model update phases, which actually change the cut and length parameters of the element before it gets placed. So this video here is sped up 3 times. Our robots probably actually could reach this speed. But for testing experiment purposes, we've slowed it down. So you can see the very nice fit into the assembly without any collision due to that prior scanning process. So overall, we envision the broader impact of this research to help develop tolerance-aware robotic construction automation, to advance sustainable and modular prefabrication methods, and address construction industry skilled labor shortages. So just to conclude, I'd like to acknowledge the NSF for funding this research, as well as support from University of Michigan. I'd also like to personally thank my family, friends, and my advisor, Arash Adel, for all their support. Here's some of the references for the paper. And yep, thank you all for listening, and you can find our contact info here.